Alright, so in the last video, he made some really good arguments against the Hebrew Masoretic text, but these variations in arguments he used don't work for the Greek Septuagint. And we have multiple sources affirming that these dates are the correct ones, like the Septuagint itself, the Sumerian Pentateuch, and the writings of Josephus. Josephus is especially interesting because several times in his writings he says his work is directly from the Hebrew text. So it's really bizarre. He must be reading a Hebrew text that contains these textual variations. Also, when we look at the writings of Paul, he says there is 430 years between the covenant that Abraham made with his seed and to Moses receiving the law. It was 430 years. But if you actually plot this out, you'll realize the Hebrew Master text is wrong, because they would have to only been in Egypt for 215 years, not 430 like it says. But when we look at multiple texts like the Greek Septuagint, the Sumerian Pentateuch, Flavius Josephus, and the writings of Paul, it all fits perfectly with this narrative. The Septuagint dates here is correct. So the Israelites were in Egypt for only 215 years. They were in Egypt and Canaan for 430 years, as these texts affirm. Also in Stephen the Martyr, when he quotes the story of the Exodus, he says 75 people came down with him into Egypt. Well, the Masoretic text says 70. Is Stephen wrong or confused? Well, no. Stephen knows Hebrew, and he's reading a different text that is closer to the Septuagint, the Sumerian Pentateuch, and a whole bunch of others. So with this, we can actually figure out what the original said. The earliest source for the Septuagint would be Origen's Hexapla, and we can see a lot of early Jewish writings, people affirming these long dates, genealogies, and ages by adding them up. So it means this is quite reasonable for us to assume. This is not to say the Septuagint is perfect. No text is. But and we can see some variations within the text. For example, there's an extra Canaan in the Septuagint text. This is an error. It exists in the older copies, not in the newer ones. So we can rule that one out quickly. Methuselah was 187 when Lamech was born, not 167 as a lot of texts say. That's a scribal error that showed up. And Lamech was not 188, he was 182 when Noah was born. I go with this Masoretic text for this. And this puts Methuselah's death at the fall, which makes sense because his name means his death shall bring, that being the end. And since Methuselah's father was Enoch, it makes sense that Enoch made a prophecy by naming his son Methuselah to prophesize the great flood. This is actually a really good argument that the original genealogies were thought to be taking these numbers literally.
Genesis 25 says Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. The text also records elsewhere Abraham lived to be 175, but this wouldn't make sense with his ancestry. Abraham would have died young by the standard of those who came before him. In fact, his ancestor Eber would have outlived him. Abraham would have been a travesty.
Doesn't work for the Septuagint, only for Hebrew Masoretic. So, doesn't matter. Genesis 17 records that Abraham 100. But if the ages of his ancestors were literal, why would he laugh?
Okay, so when we use the genealogy of the Septuagint, we realize the only real problem here would be Terah. supposedly gives birth to Abraham at 130 years. But if we look into this, like we read Genesis 11, verse 26, it says that Terah lived 70 years and begot Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. So if we look at the historical context, everybody at this time believed, every Jew, Josephus, a lot of early Christian texts believed that Terah lived 70 years, and in those 70 years he had 3 kids. Abraham, or Abram in this case, being the last of those kids. So it's kind of strange where the idea that Abram was, or Terah was 130 when Abraham was born. This comes from Acts 7 verse 4. They're trying to reconcile when it says that Abram, when Stephen the Martyr repeats the story, he says that when his father died, he moved. So what's going on here? Well, I think I figured out what's going on. Stephen the Martyr is reading a Hebrew text similar to the Sumerian Pentateuch, which says that Terah died at age 145. When you plug the math in, it all works out perfectly. Terah lived 70 years old and begot Abram at this time, and then he lived another 75 years and died at age 45, and then Abram left that day. So this would be a good argument he's making for the translation here of the Sumerian Pentateuch. Stephen the Martyr is affirming this translation.
The ages in Genesis 5 vary between the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, and the Samaritan Pentateuch. If the ages are meant to be literal, this would create a theological problem. But if the ages are symbolic for theological messaging, then these variants pose no...
Okay, so the doctrine of inerrancy only applies to the original document. It doesn't matter if you have texts that show up that have a wrong answer to them. I could take the Bible right now and write a little error in it. It wouldn't have anything, wouldn't be a problem at all for an inerrancy. But saying that these texts are lying to you, and especially there's no other way for this to be written, the dates add up. It'll give you the date when they had their firstborn, then how long they lived after that, and then they lived the total years of their life. It makes the whole text outright deceptive, if you're right.
Are fluid and can be adjusted to give theological significance. R. Wilson says, even though the genealogies may be fluid and tendential...
Is this a joke? The Jews cared a lot about genealogies. They were very important to them. And trying to judge by where these textual criticisms started showing up, they would have showed up around a time where they actually really cared about genealogies. So you can't claim the cultural context is on your side in this one.
Provided their nature and functions are taken into account. In addition, in a number of cases, when we compared parallel genealogies, we found them to be identical. So until we have evidence to the contrary, we must consider them to be accurate and potentially valuable historical sources.
Yes, all the data points to this being historical. And you have yet to present any evidence that these dates shouldn't be treated as historical as well.
That doesn't mean the author is suggesting the patriarchs didn't exist. As W.E. Alfrecht said, it is inaccurate to say that these genealogies do not represent reliable facts. It is more accurate to say that the conception of history, for and by which they were maintained, caused them to develop in certain ways. In other words, they were...
Okay, so here he points out how the numbers are random here, and they appear to be a match. And are ending with a 0, a 5, a 7, or a 2. And there's one exception, Methuselah, which ends with a 9. But I'll get to that in a sec. Well, one of the things that's very interesting about this, I think there is something going on here. And I propose that Genesis beforehand was written orally. If you look at Genesis 5, it starts off with, this is the book of the generations of Adam. So it means that Moses, or whoever is writing this, is referencing another text. And if this was passed around orally, in order for people to remember information, they might have rounded to get an approximation. And think about it. If you're living hundreds of years old, are you going to care if you're like a year or two off? And one thing about doing this is, can we explain the exception? He presents like Methuselah is the rule here. Methuselah is the exception with the 9. It's different from all the others. And the reason why Methuselah starts with a 9 is because Methuselah died the year of the flood. And the only reason why someone will put that in is because they thought Methuselah died from this. So it's great evidence that they thought these as literal dates, and that was the ages that they lived till. And also, this doesn't work for Genesis 11, as Eber and Nahor both end with a 4 and an 8. And if you insist on the Masoretic text, it actually gets worse for you. So this really confirms that at least Genesis 11 is showing this random pattern, and we're not seeing this as much. So by this logic, we should take Genesis 11 literally.
That would be a slippery slope fallacy, and assume more that is being said. Many argue the ages have to be literal, because they appear random, and are not ideal numbers that show up in other places in Scripture. Well, this is partially true, but that is because scholars recognize they are mathematical formulas, utilizing a sexagesimal counting system, or base.
An article by Carol Hill, I'll post the link in the description, where she tries to make this argument. But the problem is, if you look at her method of determining this is hexagonal, she uses addition, subtraction, and multiplication of all these numbers for the years and all these numbers for the months as well. And the thing is, the way she's doing it with these formulas, I bet you can take any number and come to an end answer with it. If we look at, say, Methuselah, and you just go like, this is just gibberish, I would not at all think that this is really what the author is trying to communicate. Same with Seth. Like, just look at this. Can you make any sense of it? I'm gonna let you guys decide. Yeah, so Methuselah, Seth, and Eber. So, enjoy, and make of it what you will. Now, these in the Sumerian kings list, these would be a great example of base 60 numerology. You see, they're simple, they're 2 bases, there's no complexity, where we just don't see that in the Genesis genealogies. So I think there is a very clear distinction between the two. So in summary, what I'm advocating is that we use textual criticism to look at these documents. So we don't have the original. The original would have been the original Hebrew text that probably got burned in the Temple of Jerusalem, if that was the best one that was preserved. But we do have copies. So if we look above and we see 4 copies, each one we find an error. But we, through textual criticism, can reconstruct what the original said. And one of the beauties of this is because there is no central authority in determining who has the correct text, we can actually preserve the text better. For example, if there was only one copy that I had that was the true text, what could I do? I could change it if I'm super nasty. So by allowing multiple copies, letting it spread freely, we actually preserve it better. So anyway, thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, and have a nice evening.